Okay, let's dive right into this. If you follow Australian politics, you've probably wondered at some point what would actually happen if a minor party suddenly held the real keys to national policy. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're breaking down a highly revealing interview with One Nation leader Pauline Hanson. We're going to look at her exact policy platform step by step to truly understand the sweeping economic and social changes she's proposing for Australia. We've taken her direct statements and built them into the blueprint you're about to see, giving us all a really clear, objective look at the actual mechanics behind her political vision.
Here's our roadmap for this breakdown. First, the shock poll context. Second, the sovereign wealth fund. Third, tax relief and hard work. Fourth, proposed government spending cuts. And finally, coalition conditions and the future. Let's get straight to it.
Part 1. The shock poll context, modeling a one-nation surge. 59. Yeah, 59. That is the massive number of lower house seats projected for One Nation in a recent, widely discussed RedBridge poll published in the Financial Review. Now, Hanson herself fully acknowledges that a poll isn't election day reality, but we have to ask the hypothetical question: if an election actually resulted in a surge of this magnitude, what exactly would this level of power mean for Australian policy? What is the actual blueprint ready to be deployed? Well, Hanson argues that this polling number absolutely isn't just a statistical fluke. She says it reflects a genuine, tangible shift on the ground. She points to actual electoral successes, like capturing 40% of the primary vote in the Farrer by-election and winning 7 seats in South Australia. She claims that when she talks to voters, she's hearing from citizens who genuinely feel destitute. Her argument is that the current Labor government's budget has severely impacted everyday cost of living, while simultaneously squeezing crucial sectors like agriculture and mining. So she positions this entire platform as the direct answer to that specific economic pain. Moving to Part 2, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, Resource Equity. Now, what is really fascinating here is the sheer scale we're talking about. $3 trillion. That's 3 with 12 zeros. Hanson's absolute cornerstone economic proposal is directly modeled on Norway's massive sovereign wealth fund, which sits at roughly that $3 trillion mark today. She argues that Australia should adopt a very similar framework to capture the staggering wealth of its own natural resources. It really establishes the immense scale of her government revenue ambitions. So how exactly does she plan to build that fund? Under her proposal, exploring companies would retain a 70% ownership stake, while the Australian government could take a maximum equity share of up to 30%. Now, she is very, very careful to frame this as an optional partnership. She explicitly states this is not coercion, it's not some sort of hostile takeover, and she absolutely insists it is not socialist policy. Instead, she defines it as taxpayers simply securing an equity share in their own national resources. And the implementation timeline for this? It is incredibly aggressive. First up, project approvals would be fast-tracked to a strict 6-month window. Second, she's proposing a massive deregulation effort. She talks about cutting what she calls red, green, black, and notably blue tape, specifying that blue tape refers to United Nations environmental guidelines. Third, the government secures its equity from the initial exploration phase right through to decommissioning. And finally, the big one, all those proceeds completely bypass standard government accounts and funnel directly into this new, entirely separate sovereign wealth fund. Hanson's blueprint totally ring-fences these incoming funds. She demands the money be excluded from consolidated revenue, so it can't be, in her words, wasted by everyday government spending. Instead, it's strictly earmarked for 3 main pillars: paying down the national debt, funding critical infrastructure, and funding national defense. Her stated ultimate goal here is to stop the $50 billion Australia pays every single year just in interest. It's a financial burden she warns will literally turn Australia into a third-world country. All right, Part 3, tax relief and hard work, reversing the burden. To really grasp her tax policy, you kind of have to look at her personal ideology about work. Leaning heavily on her background as a small business owner, she describes grueling 80 to 90-hour work weeks where she borrowed absolutely everything to succeed. She uses this deeply personal narrative to attack recent budget decisions regarding capital gains tax. She frames these tax increases as an unjust penalty on hard work by a government that she claims has contributed, quote, absolutely nothing to that individual's success. This philosophy translates into a pretty broad tax reform blueprint. Characterizing Australia as the most heavily taxed country in the world, her immediate actions would be to reverse those recent capital gains tax decisions. Furthermore, she supports the indexation of income tax rates, which is a policy she rather pointedly claims the Liberal Party is only just now catching up to her on. Ultimately, she's calling for a complete, ground-up overhaul of the taxation system, designed specifically to incentivize domestic manufacturing and local investment. Which brings us to Part 4, proposed government spending cuts, reining in the budget. So the crucial point here is how she fundamentally views the very nature of government income. Hanson sets up a really stark comparison. She argues there are only two ways for a government to get money: productivity, which means fostering growth and industry development, versus taxation, which is taking money directly from citizens. Her platform asserts that because current government spending is way out of control, taxation is far too high. Therefore, aggressive, sweeping cuts have to be made to force a reliance back onto productivity. To achieve this balanced budget, Hanson outlines a highly specific and highly aggressive list of targeted cuts across multiple sectors. Her platform proposes abolishing the Climate Change Department entirely. She wants to end bureaucratic duplication between state and federal levels in both health and education. She proposes relentlessly pursuing what she terms scammers within the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And finally, she proposes the absolute elimination of what she refers to as the Aboriginal industry. Finally, Part 5, Coalition Conditions and Future, the Price of Power. Her condition for any sort of political alliance? Completely uncompromising. In the interview, when asked about forming a coalition with the Liberal Party, she sharply criticized their leadership for being beholden to moderates and progressives within their own ranks. She refuses to tie herself to any political entity, comparing them to a dog unable to follow through on promises that she believes cannot fully execute on its commitments. Her stance is crystal clear. Any coalition would require the major party to bend to her platform, not the other way around. And this brilliantly illustrates the ideological core driving her entire 59C blueprint. If you tie all these elements together, the wealth fund, the tax cuts, the departmental abolitions, it all serves this one ultimate vision: a pivot back to primary industries like manufacturing, farming, and mining, the explicit removal of what she terms woke ideology, fostering a traditional sense of national pride in future generations, and a fierce desire to dictate terms with visionary policy rather than just reacting to the major parties. So what does this all mean? We really have to ask ourselves, if a $3 trillion sovereign wealth fund was actually paired with massive departmental cuts and radical tax reform, how would this sweeping blueprint fundamentally reshape the Australian economy? Sure, it is a hypothetical scenario based on a shock poll, but it's a meticulously structured vision that her supporters are fiercely rallying behind. What do you think the long-term impact of this specific policy mix would actually be? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the blueprints behind the politics.